Hello, this is One Black British Woman's Voice. Today I want to touch on the recent exposure of a surgeon called Patterson, who was a white surgeon jailed, I think, for 15 years recently for a number of wicked acts. I can't think of the technical medical term for it, but there are a number of acts which I'll go into detail a little bit later on. But first of all, the reason why I'm doing this video is so that I could look at the discrepancy between how black criminality is defined in comparison to white criminality. This surgeon was a white man, and what I found is the acts that he perpetuated afford him a description which is avoided or was avoided in a documentary that I watched on him today, and I just want to touch on that. So, for instance, let me give you an example. I mean, if you're black or you're brown, you'll already understand what I mean in that for instance, floods over in America, when white people are shown carrying luggage or whatever or food, they're called survivors. But when someone black is filmed carrying bags of food in a black bag, whatever, they're called looters. So all those associative words, those negative associative words which are used to define black people, their experiences, to relegate them or their experiences into the category of criminal, whereas white people who do perpetuate the same acts or the same crimes are given a different status. They're given an explanation, or they're certainly not called a criminal. Anyway, basically, this surgeon, Patterson, was a surgeon that worked, a British man, who, after a long period of time, was investigated for operating on women and removing breast tissue, or trying to use a technique that wasn't actually endorsed by the Medical Association, whereby instead of removing a cancerous breast in its entirety, he would remove bits and pieces of it, leaving portions of the breast behind. And he would operate on these women using this technique, using the mantra that it would be good to do so because then you can rebuild on that breast. So if I leave a portion of breast, I can reconstruct a new breast after the surgery based on the portions of tissue which are left behind. He also operated on a great number of women and would detail in his documents later on that he had removed cancerous tissue, but in fact he hadn't removed the cancerous tissue. Now, as a result of this surgeon, Patterson, a white man, using these techniques, what happened was that these women would only have a portion of their breast removed and then the cancer would come back. So, however, he'd been doing this for a great many number of years, and one of the ways he got away with using these techniques, one of the ways he got away with operating on women and only removing portions of the breasts, and one of the ways he actually got away with operating on women and not even removing the lumps, was because he had higher managerial approval. Now, the way I see it is the reason why he got managerial approval for doing these techniques, because patients would come forward and complain and they'd say, look, you haven't removed all my breasts. The deal was you remove my entire breast, and he would say no. Patients would come forward complaining about this. But what the management of that hospital would say, but basically the management of that hospital gave this surgeon, Patterson, a pass to carry on. And to top it off, he also had a private practice, which I think, based on what I saw in a documentary, is where he was able to carry out surgery where he didn't even remove the lumps from the breasts at all, from cancerous breasts at all. Now, you've got to have rocks in your head not to understand or see that the reason why management allowed him to carry on with these nefarious procedures is because they were experimenting on women. Point blank, that's what they were doing. There was an implicit consent that he carry on, because they were probably using these women for data in terms of what happens if you only remove a portion of the breast instead of all of it, and they were probably trying to think of a new technique, and they let this Patterson butcher these women. They let Patterson carry out these impractical, pointless surgeries, probably because they just wanted to collate data and see, well, if we do this, what is the outcome? So you got to have rocks in your head if you don't see that. This is completely what I see. But what was interesting in this documentary is that they were talking to the victims. They were talking to these women who could have lived if he had removed the entire breast. they were talking to women who were describing their experiences, that, you know, they talked about the fact that this guy, you know, he was really arrogant. You know, I would wake up from surgery and say, why haven't you removed all of my breasts? And he'd be arrogant. Then there was another woman that said, well, I don't think I've got cancer. And he was very arrogant and what are the other words that would describe, you know, attached to arrogance, and forthright and grandiose, and telling these women, what I've done you a service. Do you know, I've removed only a portion of your breast because, you know, I can reconstruct your breast, and what I say goes. These are all hallmarks of a psychopath, by the way. Lack of empathy, narcissism, a belief that you are above and beyond the law are just some of the core traits of a psychopath. However, interestingly enough, as I watched this documentary, no one described him as a psychopath. They had some DCI, this woman from West Midlands, come on, and she was the investigation portion of the documentary. So after a few years, you know, there were so many complaints, and you know, so many women coming back to the hospital and subsequently dying because the cancer had come back in the remaining portion of the breasts which weren't removed, that, you know, all of a sudden it was, we have to investigate him. And the police stepped in, and this DCI, interestingly enough, says something along the lines of, she said, what we couldn't figure out was his motivation. And this DCI says, I can only fathom that his motivation was money, because what they also focused on was his opulent lifestyle. And what they said was it must have been money, because if you looked at his records, after he would operate on someone, he would tick the box claiming that he had conducted a surgery that was far more expensive than the actual surgery he'd given them. So this DCI, leave it to the police, to come up with these pointless theories, showed her face on this documentary and said, well, I could only think that it has to do with wealth. He wanted to accumulate funds. But that would have been through his private practice, and that would have been by the by. What was interesting is that she did not once use the word psychopath. Now, guaranteed, if it was a black person, there'd be more than the word psychopath being bandied about here. But it was it's not restraint, it's the head in the sand excuses made for this white surgeon for actually what he did was a crime perpetuated by a psychopath. They then went on to, I think it was another policeman, a police constable, someone or other, another white male or a white male policeman, and they also posited the question, what was his motivation? And this police constable came up with some theory about, I don't even think it was funds. I can't recall what it was, but again, it was this ludicrous theory that had no substantial basis in common sense, essentially. So I'm sitting here watching this documentary, listening to the fact that this Ian Patterson, who would operate willy-nilly on women, removing portions of breasts and leaving portions of breasts behind, operating on women and claiming that he had removed cancerous lumps, but he hadn't. I'm listening to the, you know, this description of this man, and the description of him is aggressive, arrogant, you know, lives an opulent lifestyle, loved appearances, owned very fine wines, had his own. All these traits are indicative of a psychopath. And yet, during the course of this documentary, when asked what could possibly be Ian Patterson's motivation, not one of these white police officers or these specialists conjectured that this man was a psychopath. They all based it on the theory that this man, or the notion that this man simply wanted to get richer. Defies belief, doesn't it? Do you see the difference in description? If this were a black surgeon, he would be a psychopath. He'd be a nutcase. All sorts of discussion about mental health would be brought up. Everything would be thrown under the bus if it were a black person in question. But this white surgeon, apparently it's because he wanted to make money. Well, tell me this, what money did he gain? Or what would he gain from operating on a woman and not removing a cancerous lump? He still gets paid. This was a psychopath. And in this documentary about this psychopath, the word psychopath wasn't mentioned once. It just also reminds me of the woman, the medical student who stabbed her boyfriend after a cocaine binge, and the judge declared that she had a promised career and he didn't want to indent that. And it was just the sublimeness of it all, that these psychopaths, these criminal psychopaths, would be described in any other mantle but then as a psychopath. But this is the world that we live in. This is the world that we live in. It's one description for the black, it's one description for the brown, it's another description for the white man, for the white person. And yet we as black and brown people are savvy. We know that this person was a nutcase and he was a degenerate. Yet, bizarrely, white people think that by skipping over words and omitting the facts, somehow we'll concur with their theory. But we know what this person was. This also reminds me of the Myra Hindley. Myra Hindley was a white woman who, with a man called Ian Bradley, would trawl the streets in the van, kidnap young children, rape and kill them while recording their cries, and then buried their body in the moors. And I remember watching this documentary about Myra Hindley, this white woman. And the audacity of this documentary tried to confer the theory or the notion, the idea that this woman had somehow been swept into Ian Bradley's psychopathy, that somehow this woman was perfectly normal until she met Ian Bradley. Listen, birds of a feather flock together. Do you know, someone gave me a saying once where she says the reason why certain people get together is because their demons are aware of each other. Their demons are familiar with each other. And the idea that Myra Hindley would trawl the streets looking for children, entice them into a van and then tape record their pleas for please don't kill me, because somehow she was swept into it by a psychopath man, Ian Brady. This defies belief. What is it with white people and their avoidance of certain words and phrases? Do you know, what is it with them? It's a very bizarre world they inhabit. Anyway, so that was my thinking today. That, you know, looking at this Ian Patterson surgeon, seeing what he did, the avoidance of calling him what he was, and also that this is not just a one-off. This is a common theme throughout white-funded, white-filmed, white content documentaries on criminals in general. You know, this not even tiptoeing, this utter dismissal of the obvious, and this embracing of the delusion, you know, that this person was all very well and nice up until this embracing of the delusion that this person was, you know, operating on women and leaving cancerous cells behind because he just wanted to be rich. There's not even a connect. There's not even a logical connect between the two theories. Anyway, I'm one black British woman. That's my thoughts on the subject. I'm out. Adios.